The silence of Angkor, when 1 million souls vanished from the jungle. Consider the weight of absence, not the sudden disappearance of a single ship or the overnight ruin of a city, but the gradual dissolution of an entire civilization. A metropolis that once held perhaps 1 million people, the largest pre-industrial urban center in the world, slowly emptying until only stone temples remained, wrapped in the embrace of jungle roots. This is the mystery of Angkor. Between the 9th and 15th centuries, the Khmer Empire dominated mainland Southeast Asia. Its capital, Angkor, sprawled across more than 400 square miles, larger than modern Paris, larger than Los Angeles. Recent LiDAR surveys, which use laser technology to penetrate jungle canopy, reveal an urban landscape of staggering complexity. Intricate canal systems, massive reservoirs called barays, densely packed neighborhoods, elaborate road networks connecting hundreds of temples. This wasn't merely a ceremonial center with scattered villages. This was a functioning metropolis, supported by sophisticated hydraulic engineering that channeled monsoon rains into agricultural systems, feeding potentially 1 million inhabitants. And then, gradually, it emptied. The temples remained, Angkor Wat, Bayon, Ta Prohm, but the people departed. The administrative apparatus dissolved. The hydraulic systems fell into disrepair. By the time European explorers arrived in the 19th century, Angkor had become legend, its structures reclaimed by jungle, its history preserved primarily through inscriptions carved in stone and the memories of distant descendants. What happened? This question has occupied archaeologists, historians, and climate scientists for decades. Unlike civilizations destroyed by catastrophic invasion or volcanic eruption, Angkor's decline appears to have been processional, unfolding across generations. The historical record from this period is frustratingly sparse. The Khmer left no extensive written chronicles comparable to Chinese dynastic histories or European monastic records. What we know comes from archaeological evidence, stone inscriptions that grow noticeably sparser in later periods, accounts from Chinese diplomats who visited the empire, and environmental data extracted from tree rings, sediment cores, and ancient climate records. The mainstream academic consensus attributes Angkor's decline to a combination of factors: environmental stress, political instability, economic transformation, and external military pressure. But the precise mechanisms, the sequence of events, the relative importance of each factor, these remain subjects of active scholarly debate. Tonight, we explore not a conspiracy of silence, but an actual silence. The gap between what inscriptions proclaim, the eternal glory of God Kings, and the reality of a civilization that could not sustain itself. Because sometimes the most profound historical mysteries aren't about hidden knowledge, but about understanding how the intricate systems that support human civilization can unravel, leaving behind only questions carved in stone. The foundation. What we know with certainty. The Khmer Empire's historical trajectory is well documented in broad strokes, even if specific details remain contested. Founded in 802 CE, when King Jayavarman II declared independence from Javanese influence and established the cult of the Devaraja, the God King, the empire would endure for more than 6 centuries. Its rulers constructed elaborate temple complexes that served simultaneously as religious centers, administrative hubs, and monuments to royal authority. The most famous, Angkor Wat, was built in the early 12th century by Suryavarman II, originally dedicated to the Hindu god Vishnu. But Angkor's true genius lay not in its temples, impressive as they are, but in its water management. The Khmer engineered massive barays, artificial reservoirs, some spanning several square miles. They dug hundreds of miles of canals. They constructed elaborate systems of dikes, moats, and channels. This hydraulic infrastructure served multiple purposes. It captured monsoon rains, distributed water during dry seasons, supported intensive rice agriculture, facilitated transportation, and symbolically represented the cosmic ocean surrounding Mount Meru in Hindu-Buddhist cosmology. This system supported remarkable population density. Recent archaeological surveys suggest that at its height in the 12th and 13th centuries, the Greater Angkor region may have housed between 750,000 and 1 million people, making it comparable to contemporary Song dynasty cities in China and substantially larger than any European city of that era. The population wasn't concentrated only at the temple centers, but spread across a vast, low-density urban sprawl, with houses built on stilts amid rice paddies and canals. Chinese diplomat Zhou Daguan, who visited Angkor in 1296-1297, left a detailed account describing a still-functioning, prosperous city with bustling markets, elaborate religious processions, and sophisticated social hierarchies. His account confirms that even in the late 13th century, Angkor remained a major urban center. Yet within 150 years, the city's administrative and political functions had relocated. By the mid-15th century, Angkor was no longer the Khmer capital. The center of political power had shifted southward to Phnom Penh, closer to the Mekong River and maritime trade networks. The temples remained occupied by Buddhist monks and continued as pilgrimage sites, but the massive population had dispersed. This is established fact, not disputed. What scholars debate intensely is the why. What specific cascade of pressures and failures led a million-person metropolis to gradually empty, leaving one of history's most magnificent architectural achievements to the jungle? The environmental hypothesis. When the waters failed, the most prominent theory emerging from recent research centers on environmental stress, particularly the failure of Angkor's hydraulic infrastructure during a period of climate instability. Climate scientists analyzing tree ring data, oxygen isotopes in stalagmites from regional caves, and sediment cores from lakes have identified significant climate anomalies during the 14th and early 15th centuries. The evidence suggests the region experienced what's called the medieval climate anomaly transition, a period of intense variability marked by severe, multi-decade droughts punctuated by unusually intense monsoons. For a civilization built around capturing and distributing water, this volatility would have been catastrophic. During droughts, the barays couldn't capture sufficient water to sustain year-round agriculture. Rice yields would have plummeted. The canals that connected the urban sprawl would have dried up, disrupting transportation and commerce. The symbolic and practical center of Khmer civilization, water, would have failed. But drought alone doesn't explain Angkor's abandonment. After all, the droughts eventually ended. What makes the environmental hypothesis compelling is evidence of systemic failure. Archaeologists examining the hydraulic infrastructure have found signs of breakdown, silt accumulation in canals suggesting inadequate maintenance, erosion damage from intense flooding, breaches in dikes and embankments. LiDAR data reveals that some canals were hastily modified or extended, possibly desperate attempts to redirect dwindling water supplies. Pollen analysis from sediment cores shows changes in vegetation patterns consistent with agricultural stress and possible deforestation in watersheds that fed the baray systems. The hydraulic network was extraordinarily complex, an engineering marvel, but also a system that required constant maintenance, centralized coordination, and substantial labor investment. Scholars propose that the climate variability of the 14th, 15th centuries may have pushed this system beyond its adaptive capacity. During severe droughts, there simply wasn't enough water. During intense monsoons, floods overwhelmed the infrastructure, causing breaches and erosion that would have been difficult to repair. Dr. Brendan Buckley, a climate scientist who has studied tree ring records from the region, argues that decades-long droughts followed by catastrophic flooding would have created a feedback loop. Agricultural failure reduced the labor and resources available for infrastructure maintenance, which worsened the impact of subsequent environmental stress, which further reduced capacity for repair. Each cycle degraded the system more severely. Yet questions remain. Climate stress was regional. It affected not only Angkor, but neighboring areas as well. Why did Angkor specifically decline while other centers adapted or persisted? Why did the population relocate rather than rebuild after conditions stabilized? Environmental stress may have been a critical trigger, but scholars increasingly recognize that it likely interacted with political, economic, and social vulnerabilities specific to Angkor's highly centralized system. The environmental hypothesis is well supported by physical evidence, but it doesn't stand alone. It forms one thread in a more complex tapestry of decline. The political and economic transformation. While climate scientists focus on environmental stress, historians examine political and economic factors that may have made Angkor particularly vulnerable during this period of environmental challenge. The Khmer Empire in the 14th to around 15th centuries faced increasing military pressure from Thai kingdoms to the west, particularly Ayutthaya, which was rising as a regional power. Thai forces sacked Angkor in 1431, a date traditionally cited as the end of Angkor's importance, though recent scholarship suggests the decline was already well underway by this point. But military invasion alone doesn't explain urban abandonment. Cities are frequently conquered. They're not always abandoned. What makes the military pressure thesis more compelling is when it's combined with economic transformation. During the 13th and 15th centuries, Southeast Asian trade patterns were shifting dramatically. Maritime commerce was expanding, driven by growing Chinese demand under the Ming dynasty and increasing integration with Indian Ocean trade networks. Coastal ports offered access to this lucrative trade in ways that inland capitals could not. Angkor's location, once strategic for controlling agricultural hinterlands and overland trade routes, became less advantageous in an era of maritime commerce. The Khmer economy had traditionally been based on rice agriculture and control of inland territories. As maritime trade became more important, centers closer to navigable rivers and coasts gained advantage. Some scholars propose that Khmer elites recognized this shift and actively chose to relocate the capital to more commercially advantageous locations. Phnom Penh, situated at the confluence of the Mekong, Tonle Sap, and Basak rivers, offered much better access to maritime trade networks. The relocation may not have been forced by environmental or military catastrophe, but rather a calculated strategic adaptation to changing economic realities. This interpretation is supported by the fact that the temples themselves weren't destroyed or deliberately abandoned in panic. Angkor Wat and other major temples continued functioning as Buddhist religious centers. Monks maintained the sites. Pilgrims visited. What ended was the administrative and political function, the concentration of population, the role as imperial capital. Dr. Roland Fletcher, an archaeologist who has studied Angkor's urban structure extensively, suggests that the very nature of Angkor's sprawling, hydraulic-dependent urban form made it vulnerable in ways more compact cities were not. The system required enormous coordination and investment to maintain. When that centralized authority weakened, whether due to military pressure, environmental stress, or economic reorientation, the entire urban structure became increasingly difficult to sustain. The population didn't vanish. They relocated, dispersed to smaller settlements, moved to areas with better access to water or trade, followed elites and resources as political power shifted. The abandonment wasn't apocalyptic disappearance. It was gradual demographic redistribution. Yet this raises its own questions. If the relocation was strategic and gradual, why didn't later Khmer rulers maintain Angkor as a secondary center? Why did the hydraulic infrastructure fall into such complete disrepair? Why does the archaeological record suggest increasing strain and crisis rather than orderly transition? The political and economic factors are clear, but they intertwine with environmental stress in ways that make isolating single causes difficult. Perhaps that's the point. Angkor's decline wasn't caused by one factor, but by the intersection of multiple vulnerabilities that converged during a critical period. The systemic fragility hypothesis. In recent years, some scholars have proposed a more integrative framework, that Angkor's very success created systemic vulnerabilities that made collapse more likely when stresses emerged. The hydraulic infrastructure was a triumph of engineering, but it created path dependency. The system locked the civilization into a particular trajectory that became difficult to change. Maintaining the barays, canals, and dikes required continuous investment. As long as the system functioned, it supported large populations. But the infrastructure had limited redundancy. When components failed, the effects cascaded through the entire network. Dr. Martin Polkinghorne, analyzing sediment cores from Angkor's water systems, found evidence of increasing siltation over time, suggesting that intensive agriculture and possible deforestation in watersheds gradually degraded the system long before the climate crises of the 14th and 15th centuries. The infrastructure was slowly becoming less efficient, requiring more maintenance to achieve the same results. Additionally, Angkor's sprawling urban form, while impressive, was less defensible and more resource-intensive than compact walled cities. When military threats intensified and economic incentives shifted, the disadvantages of this urban structure became more apparent. The system that had been Angkor's strength Its ability to concentrate and support a massive population through hydraulic engineering became a liability when the environmental, political, and economic contexts shifted. The population was too large to sustain when agricultural productivity declined. The infrastructure was too complex to maintain without centralized authority and resources. The location was too inland to capitalize on maritime trade. Angkor's abandonment, in this view, wasn't failure. It was adaptation. The civilization survived by transforming, by relocating, by restructuring. The Khmer people didn't vanish. Their political and urban organization changed in response to new realities. But this doesn't diminish the mystery. How do societies recognize when their fundamental systems are no longer viable? What mechanisms allow for managed transformation versus catastrophic collapse? Why did Angkor's transformation involve such complete abandonment of its urban core, while the temples remained sacred? These are questions without definitive answers, but they are worth asking because they illuminate how civilizations adapt or fail to adapt to changing circumstances. What we cannot know stand now in the silence of Ta Prohm, where silk cotton trees have wrapped their roots around stone corridors. Walk the empty causeway to Angkor Wat, where only a handful of monks and tourists disturb the morning stillness. Try to imagine this space filled with the noise of 1,000,000 lives. Markets, rituals, children, artisans, bureaucrats, farmers returning from paddies, boats navigating canals. That world is irrecoverable. We have the stones they carved. We have the infrastructure they built. We have Zhou Daguan's single Chinese account and scattered inscriptions that grow fewer as centuries progress. We have environmental data extracted from trees and sediment. We have the evidence of archaeology, foundations, pottery shards, tools, the layout of streets and canals. But we don't have the conversations, the debates among elites deciding whether to stay or relocate. We don't have the daily experiences of families watching water levels drop in the barays, wondering if the rains would come. We don't have the moment of realization when someone last locked their house and departed for Phnom Penh. We don't have the internal deliberations of kings weighing military threats against economic opportunities, against religious obligations. History gives us structures, patterns, evidence, but it cannot fully restore the subjective experience of living through civilizational transformation. What scholars now recognize is that Angkor's abandonment likely wasn't a single event with a single cause, but a process, a confluence of environmental stress, political pressure, economic reorientation, and systemic vulnerabilities that made maintaining the urban center increasingly untenable. The civilization didn't end. It transformed. The Khmer people continued, their descendants forming the basis of modern Cambodia. What ended was a particular form of urban organization, a specific political structure, a hydraulic-dependent way of life that had sustained 1,000,000 people in the jungle. Perhaps what makes Angkor's silence so profound isn't the mystery of what happened. Scholars have reconstructed a plausible, evidence-based narrative. But what it reveals about the fragility of human systems, even the most sophisticated infrastructure, the most magnificent temples, the most populous cities, can empty when the complex balance of environmental conditions, economic incentives, and political stability shifts beyond a critical threshold. Angkor wasn't destroyed by catastrophe. It was undone by accumulated stresses the system could no longer absorb. The weight of emptiness. We began by imagining absence, the silence of a city that once held 1 million souls. We've explored environmental stress that challenged agricultural systems, political pressures that weakened centralized authority, economic transformations that reduced Angkor's strategic value, and systemic vulnerabilities that turned strengths into liabilities. What becomes clear is that history rarely offers simple explanations. The abandonment of Angkor was multi-causal, processional, extending across generations. It wasn't hidden or suppressed. It simply occurred in an era and region where written documentation was limited and where the people experiencing it left few direct accounts of their choices and struggles. The gaps in our knowledge aren't evidence of conspiracy, but reflections of historical contingency. Which documents survived, which perspectives were recorded, which evidence the jungle preserved, and which it consumed. Yet those gaps remain worth contemplating. Because Angkor's story isn't merely ancient history. It's a meditation on how civilizations respond to stress, how infrastructure can become both enabler and constraint, how environmental change intersects with human adaptability, and how even the most impressive human achievements remain contingent on balancing countless variables that can shift without warning. The temples remain monuments to human ambition and engineering genius. The silence that surrounds them is both mystery and memorial, reminding us that every city, every civilization, every system we build exists in delicate balance with forces we don't entirely control. Perhaps we should rest tonight with that thought, not as cause for anxiety, but as invitation to humility. The past teaches not through definitive answers, but through honest reckoning with complexity. And sometimes the most valuable thing history offers isn't certainty about what happened, but thoughtful consideration of what it means that things change, systems fail, and silence eventually claims even the grandest human endeavors. The jungle keeps its secrets gently. The stones remember what they can. And we, centuries later, sift through evidence, asking questions that may never be fully answered. Because that's the work of honest scholarship, acknowledging both what we've learned and what remains, perhaps forever, just beyond our reach.